Hello and good afternoon, and welcome to the Upward Mobility Framework Overview Workshop, introducing local leaders to the Upward Mobility Framework. My name is Will Engelhart, and I'm a Senior Training and Technical Assistance Manager at the Urban Institute. Today, myself and my colleagues at Urban, Gabby Velasco and Arzo Azizi, are going to be presenting on the Upward Mobility Framework together. And just a quick note on this training, we are presenting on the same content as we covered on an April 4th webinar with the same title. So if you attended that session, a lot of the material we will be covering will be very familiar to you or quite similar. So please don't feel obligated to stay on if you did attend that session, though the question and answer section might be different, certainly. If you were looking for the next topical training on the Upward Mobility Framework, that will be held on April 25th, when we'll be diving deeper into the mobility metrics. And Katie just put in the chat the link to that training. And if this is your first time attending one of these workshops, you should also feel free to register for that. It will be the second round of trainings and hopefully helpful to everybody. So we encourage you to register. So putting that housekeeping item aside, for today's agenda, first I'm going to go over the history and development of the Upward Mobility Framework in just a little bit of detail, which is linked there on the agenda. And after I do so, we're going to have a brief interactive exercise for everybody. So please do come ready to engage with us in about 10 minutes or so. We will have the option, or do have the option, for folks to come off mute and engage. So hope that you do so. Then I'm going to pass it to my colleague Gabby, who's going to provide an overview of the Upward Mobility Framework and the mobility metric data table specifically. Then Arzo is going to talk about ways that the framework has been used in communities and localities specifically, and also provide some guidance regarding available resources and some additional forthcoming trainings other than the one that I just mentioned. Finally, at different intervals, we'll check in for questions if folks have them, and we'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for a question and answer period. Before that time, we ask that folks do stay on mute throughout the presentation if possible, but welcome folks to drop any questions that come up in the chat, and we'll make sure to address them, and we'll pause at different times to try to address them too. Once it's time for the Q&A, if folks do want to come off chat at that time as well, we just ask that folks use the raise hand function, which should be to the bottom right-ish of your screen. And we can call on people to ask us questions directly then as well. And don't be scared. Last time folks came off mute and it was very helpful. In the meantime, someone will be monitoring the chat to ensure questions are answered. And just a note, you probably saw this, but we are recording today's presentation. And the slides and the presentation itself will be shared out afterwards for everybody. Okay, thanks. And as I mentioned, now I'm going to just provide a brief overview of the history and development of the Upward Mobility Framework. No problem. So the Upward Mobility Framework builds on a previous effort by the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which was a convening of 24 leading voices representing academia, practitioners, the faith community, philanthropy, community stakeholders, and the private sector. It was convened by us, the Urban Institute, with support from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the partnership asked this question that you see here: what would it take to dramatically and sustainably increase mobility from poverty? The aim of this partnership, which took place a number of years ago, was to gather research and evidence and coalesce around a shared answer to this question that was asked just broadly to the group. And it resulted in some notable findings, which has shaped our work that brings us here today. So this key finding that was found was that mobility is about more than just economic success. Upward mobility is more than that. True upward mobility requires that people have power and autonomy, as you see here, and also a sense of being valued by their community, along with economic mobility and success. To move out of poverty and stay out of poverty, people also needed to feel that they have power and autonomy in their lives, meaning the ability to make choices and influence actions that affect their future, and that they are valued in their community and can contribute to it. So all of those together must be working to have that three-part definition and allow for upward mobility. This broader conception of mobility that again includes economic success, value in the community and belonging, and power and autonomy is what we refer to and will refer to as the three-part definition of mobility from poverty. And it drives our work and the conception of a lot of the work that we're doing around the mobility metrics and otherwise moving forward. Before moving on from the three-part definition, and talking about some ways that we built evidence around it and actionalized it, I just want to spend a moment discussing how structural racism impacts upward mobility and this three-part definition. For most people experiencing poverty in the United States today, opportunities to achieve greater economic success, power and autonomy, belonging, and dignity are blocked by longstanding structural barriers, not by a failure of individual effort at all. Many of these barriers have resulted from and are perpetuated by racist beliefs, norms, policies, and practices, and have produced deep and persistent inequities in the United States, of course. For example, the practice of redlining, which is denying mortgage loans to certain neighborhoods or areas deemed high risk based on the race, ethnicity, and immigration status of the people living there. This practice created stark racial disparities that persist to this day in home ownership, wealth building, and school funding, and others, and ultimately someone's ability to achieve economic success. These barriers to home ownership not just impact economic success, but impact someone's ability to feel that they have control over their life and make the choices that they want to make. Homeownership barriers can also make it difficult for people to feel valued, both in their neighborhood and connected to their neighbors, especially if their inability to buy a home leads to them moving more frequently, for example, and many other reasons. But just simply put, structural racism can't be ignored, must be acknowledged when thinking about ways to combat barriers to upward mobility, and is a core component of challenges we'll be facing in trying to actionalize this work. Next slide. Okay, so with all of that context of the three-part definition in mind, when this was developed and defined a couple of years ago, folks came to us and they said, okay, this was great. It's really helpful and it resonates with us a lot, but what does it actually look like in practice? So Urban Institute, being a research and policy organization, we began a research project to identify successful interventions that had achieved all three parts of this definition of economic success, power and autonomy, and belonging. We looked specifically for interventions that had rigorous evidence of these three components and strong intentionality in improving power and autonomy and or being valued in community, along with economic success, which was the most straightforward one. So we selected 6 programs, and you see these programs here. I'm not going to go through each one of them. And before I move on, I just to talk through some of the takeaways from the exemplars, I just have like one note on the research itself. The note is that this research was intended to go broader than just talking about programs that embody the three-part definition. However, in practice, some of the criteria and evidence we used for selection somewhat pushed us towards focusing on programs rather than social movements or policy changes or systems changes, et cetera. And we consider this one of the notable limitations of the research. Programs alone, no matter how effective they are unlikely to fully break down the social and systemic barriers that prevent people from achieving mobility from poverty. And this is just simply because programs are no match for larger entrenched structural forces, such as structural racism, which I just talked about, but also just generally working at the government level, economic level, and societal level. That said, there were some major takeaways from this research, and so we just want to quickly summarize them. All 6 exemplars intentionally offered some form of one, material assistance to participants as a means of reducing stress, generating momentum around economic success in particular. And examples of this are one program used cash incentives, one program used housing voucher, and another program provided transit subsidies. All the exemplars and examples programs emphasize practices and strategies that develop human capital in some form, whether that was through high quality education, educational supports, advocacy opportunities, or career training, or a combination of those. Participants and staff at each program stress the importance of individual choice in determining service delivery. And then every exemplar placed heavy emphasis on building family-like relationships among participants, and also among staff and between the two. Staff across the programs describe building up strengths over deficits and creating a climate of acceptance where the programs felt necessary to participants to achieve their goals. Next slide. So we're providing a link, or already did, nope, to this, and I'm not going to go through this further, but there's a lot more context in the research report and the links in there in the chat for those that want to check it out. So I hope that you do so. Okay, and with that, I'm going to move us to our little exercise. So just switching gears, we just want to take a couple minutes here from you all. So if you can go to the Menti link in the chat, or hopefully that works. So hopefully go there. And if you could just tell us one word or a couple words to describe a challenge your community experiences or you're experiencing in your work with addressing upward mobility as it relates to power, autonomy, economic success, and feelings of belonging, that would be greatly appreciated. It could be any word or phrase or challenge. And if you could just put it into the prompt in the Menti, that would be really helpful. Okay, I'm getting a note that it's possibly not working. If folks could, apologies for that. If folks could just put that one word or phrase in the chat instead, that would be really appreciated. You would have seen a really nice, beautiful word cloud that would have showed up. So appreciate folks putting this in here. So I'm seeing, going back here, distrust, access, lack of living wages, wage jobs, family support, stigma. Oh, and we have some showing up on the word cloud there. Living wages, accessibility on the word cloud, data, access, funding, denial, credit ratings, racism, limited resources, lack of collaboration, low wages, childcare, and much, much more. Would anyone that put one of these words in here want to just talk through why you chose the word, or why you wanted to highlight that phrase in particular? Just come off mute, Mary. I see you raise your hand.
Yeah, so we've been implementing this framework in our community for several months now. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that there are so many different programs happening in our community around other areas, whether it is domestic violence or education. And we're just having a hard time really creating the capacity for those that need to be engaged in this process to be meaningfully engaged.
And was capacity the word that you chose for?
Yeah.
And what's the community that you're representing?
Rockford, Illinois.
Got it. Thank you. Would anyone else like to share? Please, Dr. Nozifo, apologies if I'm pronouncing your name wrong.
Oh, thank you. I was just gonna share and also just appreciate what you shared earlier on around the difficulties of dealing with issues of systemic racism through programs. That one of the things in an academic space, and one of the things that I see is that it is really hard because most of the programs we have right now, they are not in the DEI space. Let me put it this way: they are not really meant to tackle systemic racism. So we are struggling to see the DEI outcomes that we should be able to see right now, 20, 30 years later after implementing DEI initiatives. So, and one of the things that I have seen is that the issues of multi-level racism, really not just structural multi-level racism and discrimination, are major, major, major issues right now that are impacting minoritized communities. And it's hard because we are not focusing on the actual causes that needs to be addressed for us to see actual outcomes.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm assuming your word was racism related to this work. And then I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing what community you're representing as well or working with.
I'm working with an academic institution at Colorado State.
Thank you so much. Oops, sorry. We have time for maybe one more comment, and otherwise we can move on to the next section. Okay, then I'm going to happily pass it over to my colleague, Gabby Velasco, who's going to talk more about the development of the Upward Mobility Framework and the framework itself, and provide a brief overview of some of the ways to use the mobility metrics and other components. Gabby?
Awesome, thank you, Will. Hi, folks. My name is Gabby Velasco. I'm a policy associate in the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute, and I'm really excited to share some of the background on the development of the Upward Mobility Framework, and then also walk through the framework itself with y'all. So after the partnership concluded in 2018, like Will detailed, our project was created with the goal of supporting communities and creating the conditions that increase upward mobility from poverty and that narrow racial and ethnic inequities for children, youth, and adults. So we started with a focus on metrics, and we recognize that although it can take decades to measure generational mobility, local leaders needed actionable information to help guide their decision-making in both the short and the medium term. So we were set with a charge of developing a comprehensive but concise, fun combo set of metrics that can be used to support communities across the country and change makers across sectors. In 2019, we partnered with a cross-disciplinary working group of scholars who systematically reviewed factors that research shows affect long-term mobility from poverty and which could be influenced by local and state policies. This work was refined over multiple years through testing in partnership with 8 counties, whose work I'll talk about more in a moment, as well as additional research and feedback from many more organizations and communities. And in partnership with our working group and also bringing in all that feedback, we created the current version of the Upward Mobility Framework that drives our project and informs our presentation to y'all today. So from 2020 to 2022, as part of a process to test the utility of the framework and the mobility metrics for local decision makers, we partnered with a set of 8 county governments and their cross-sector community coalitions, which we called our Upward Mobility Cohort. Coming out of this approach, we recognize that the mobility metrics themselves are a really key starting point, but improving the conditions that support mobility and equity in communities takes a lot more than data. Successful change requires coalition building with partners across sectors and across policy domains. It requires deep, meaningful community engagement, the addition of local data and other sources of knowledge to provide a full, nuanced understanding of the conditions in a community, and also a systems change focus that engages with the root causes of inequities. We learned so much from this cohort, and more than I can speak about today, but we just want to provide a few reflections on how our partnership with the counties approach racial equity and how we see this informing practical work moving forward. So first, equity needs to be embedded in every step of the work. Our counties really embrace the fact that racial equity is not just an outcome or a way of engaging with data, but it's also a holistic process. So to that end, data disaggregation is a necessary starting point, but it's not an endpoint in this work. And it's also important to note that there are communities who are likely to be either underrepresented or missing entirely from some metrics data, like undocumented Americans or people who are experiencing housing instability. And also to measure and begin addressing equity, we need to not just consider the magnitude of current disparities, but also commit to structural analyses of history and relations to power to account for the sources of disparities. Many cohort members conducted a process called a root cause analysis to jumpstart this process. Finally, another way to build equity into the process of local mobility work is through community engaged methods. So these strategies are ones that center residents with lived experience of intergenerational poverty and structural racism in both setting priorities and understanding the impact of suggested interventions. Some of the strategies communities used include data walks, community advisory boards, and community engaged surveying. So after all of that, you might ask, what is the Upward Mobility Framework? I'll walk through each component of the framework and the suite of mobility metrics, kind of help y'all understand what these all mean and how they fit together. On the screen is a visual of the Upward Mobility Framework. You'll see there at the top is the phrase upward mobility from poverty, because that is, as you can guess, our primary driving goal. And then every part of the framework below that is a structural support for that goal. And so I'll get into each of these structures. We start with that interconnected three-part definition of mobility from poverty that Will talked about with y'all, and that's economic success, power and autonomy, and dignity and belonging. And those are those three components that holistically encompass upward mobility. Breaking it down one level, supporting mobility from poverty are 5 essential pillars. So the first is opportunity-rich and inclusive neighborhoods. Neighborhoods play a really central role in supporting family stability and well-being, their access to social and economic opportunities, and also their children's chances to thrive and succeed. High-quality education is our second pillar. So from preschool to post-secondary, education provides a really crucial avenue to economic and social mobility. Third is rewarding work. As we all know, jobs and wages constitute the primary source of income and economic security for most people in the US today. Fourth is healthy environment and access to good healthcare. So good and stable health helps people of all ages surmount life's challenges, excel in school and on the job, ensure their family's well-being, and fully participate in their communities. And finally, our fifth pillar is responsive and just governance. So making sure that the government is attentive to the needs of all community members and that residents who are engaged in decision-making are really central to all decision-making that happens in the community. So across these pillars is a key foundation: ensure equitable access for all, including people of color and other marginalized groups. So as Will talked about and I mentioned earlier, throughout the framework, combating persistent racial inequities is central to achieving upward mobility in communities. So we want to make sure that this is not just explicitly built in across, but it's also explicitly highlighted throughout the framework and the metrics. Then under each pillar is a set of key predictors of mobility from poverty. So these are evidence-based factors that research shows are strongly associated with the likelihood that a community can create conditions to boost the economic and social mobility of residents while narrowing racial and ethnic inequities. The predictors were chosen by the working group after a rigorous, thorough review of academic research around factors that most strongly influence mobility from poverty. These 24 predictors cover diverse aspects of community, cover all stages of the life cycle, and can be influenced by state and local policy. Now we've arrived at the mobility metrics. So for each predictor, the working group selected one metric that can be used to compare and monitor a community's performance over time. Simply put, the mobility metrics are just our way to take one aspect of a predictor and make it actionable. And while no data source is perfect, we aim to select metrics that best balance a variety of considerations. We also want to quickly preview some ways that users can utilize the metrics. This will be explored further in our next session, which is a mobility metrics focus session. But quickly, users can compare their community's metrics to peer communities to assess the extent of their local challenges and build public support for tackling it. Users can use the metrics to reveal persistent racial inequities and the structural barriers that perpetuate them. They can prioritize mobility predictors where the community's focused attention and action can have the greatest impact. Users can highlight interconnections among predictors from different policy domains to recruit partners and identify the roles different actors can play. And users can set targets for improving local mobility metrics and narrowing inequities as part of a strategy for meaningful changes in investments, policies, and practices. And finally, they can use them to monitor the metrics over time to assess their community's progress and hold local stakeholders accountable. It's a lot of info and a lot of very specific terms. So I'm going to pause here to answer any questions you'll have about the metrics or other elements of the framework.
Thanks, Gabby. And I'll just note there's a question in the chat from Mary around if there's a resource for conducting a root cause analysis. And I attempted to answer that referencing the Upward Mobility Framework Planning Guide for Local Action. And specifically, there are steps kind of, or literally towards the middle of that guide, the Step 5, develop an initial understanding of local mobility conditions. Step 6, build a fuller picture of mobility conditions in your community. And Step 7, determine your strategic actions that aren't framed necessarily as a root cause analysis, but I think get at some of what you're asking about. But Gabby, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that as well.
I believe there's also through that same base website that Will shared, we have a blog, and I do believe we have a blog that's focused on a particular case study of a community that did a root cause analysis. So that may also have some additional resources for like operationalizing this thing. All right, any other questions? We'll also have a broad Q&A at the end of this, but wanted to create some space here. Luis.
Hi, I've been following this for a while now, and I've been doing some research into social determinant theory and using it in the urban planning space. And I'm curious how you would go about, or what your recommendation would be, or your perspective at least, in using something like this in a community where there's already a pressure on development, right? And a lot of those development patterns have already happened. And so where this population of people who were facing disparities has been displaced, right? And so what we're seeing is a lot of people who no longer live in this place. And in a space where we're trying to be equitable and we're trying to be mindful about the past injustices and what happened, like how, if you're doing something like for a root cause analysis, for example, or if you're doing trying to use mobility metrics in a community where these people aren't necessarily there, and you're predominantly having a lot of people who are not necessarily represented, like you were mentioning, people who are unhoused, people who are undocumented. Like if your community consists for the most part of upper middle class residents and the damage has been done, so to speak, already, like how could we use this tool to be able to still be equitable in a place where like that population is like shrinking at a very high and disproportionate rate?
That's a super interesting question. Thank you for asking it. And if I misunderstand it at any point, please clarify. I think first what I'll say is, so our metrics go at the lowest to the city level and then also at the county level. So as far as like within a city or a county, as far as like displacement and gentrification goes within like census tracts, our data doesn't look at census tracts, it just looks at cities and counties. So all those people would be covered, but in the case of broader displacement, so displacement like away from the city or the county, I feel like one thing that actually our metrics were kind of used for in a collaboration we did with some counties a few months ago is we presented the metrics to the county leaders who were in primarily like the workforce space. And they saw it and they went, this doesn't sound right. Like, we know our community. These numbers aren't reflecting what we're seeing with the people we serve. What's up with that? And so we went into it deeper. And honestly, what we saw is that through people's like lived experience and intimate knowledge of their own community, seeing numbers that don't line up is its own kind of case making of like what publicly available data is not tracking like the people who need this most. And it can be kind of a case making thing of like, there's obviously some people who are being made invisible within data and so are not getting the kind of targeted interventions that are needed. I feel like more generally though, that's a question for like the framework. And I think one that I would love to engage with more deeply and maybe offline, because it's not something that we've considered before, but I think it's a really important thing to note. Any additions from the team?
I'll just add, I don't, yeah, I mean, that's a challenging question to say the least, and a challenging situation you all are grappling with in your community. And just the one thing I would add is one resource that the mobility metrics could potentially provide, which we will provide. We haven't provided a ton of details on how to use them, but is there at the county and city level, as Gabby mentioned, it could be a way to document these changes at a minimum and show, and I think this is what Gabby was referencing, show community members and such that this community is currently now middle upper class, and then county X, where populations have been forced to move or have moved recently, now is much lower in terms of economic success or some of these other determinants. Part of the metrics is also showing some of these other metrics than just economic success that might be really useful for folks to look at, maybe never consider about how it's influencing the communities that you're looking at. So you could compare some of the differences if you know the communities that folks are moving to. If you don't, potentially less helpful, but you could document and compare some of the differences in these communities just for thinking through what some of the ramifications of development and these changes have been. So just more documentation purposes of some sort.
Yeah, Will, I definitely agree with that. And that made me think that something that we kind of emphasized throughout our work is that the metrics and the framework are one component of broader work and should be a starting point, and local data and community engaged data more specifically is really essential for any kind of upward mobility work. And so it can also be like you have the metrics data, but then you can also look at like the longitudinal analysis of like the demographic data and changing demographics over time, or other factors, and kind of piece together that narrative that shows, I feel like sometimes some local leaders can see the numbers like quote unquote getting better and be like, oh great, the work we're doing in the community is solving the problem. But like you noted, that's often not the case with displacement. And so it can be a way to kind of contextualize it and kind of make the case of why these numbers are not indicating the kind of positive outcome that they may seem to give on first glance. Hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for that really thoughtful question. All right, awesome. With that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Arzo Azizi.
Great, thanks, Gabby. Hi, everybody. My name is Arzo Azizi. I'm a policy analyst with the Research to Action Lab at the Urban Institute. I just wanted to flag, if If I at any point start to lag, please let me know. I think I'm experiencing a little bit of internet difficulties. But like Gabby mentioned, I'll be briefly walking through how to access your community's data tables, where you can view the mobility metrics that we have available for your county or city. And I just wanted to also flag that at the next session on April 25th, or as we're calling it, the mobility metrics session, we'll be taking a closer look at the data tables and actually walking through the different tabs, discussing how to interpret the metrics, and just in general walking through the mobility metrics suite in more detail. And so with that, the first step to accessing your county's data tables is to navigate to the data tab. So there are a couple of ways that you can do this. If you wanted to use your phone today, you can scan the QR code and it'll take you straight to the data landing page on the Upward Mobility Project website. There was also a link dropped in the chat if that would make it easier. But if you're familiar with the Upward Mobility Project website, in the center tab labeled data, that is where you can also find our data landing page. And so once you're there, it'll look exactly like this with the title, Measuring Upward Mobility in Counties and Cities Across the US. Another resource I wanted to flag on the same page is a video tutorial. So this tutorial guides you through all the main features of the data tables in case you wanted to learn more ahead of our next session or to even review what we're discussing today. Great. And so here's where you can start the search for your community. You'll scroll down to where it says select a county or city to explore your community's mobility metrics. And the first step is for you to decide which type of geography makes the most sense for your needs. So you might ask yourself, what jurisdiction is the one where I have the most influence? Or which policies at what level of geography most impact me and my work in my community? Or where do I currently work and live in and want to learn more about? And so with that answer in mind, you can select the state that you're in. And then an additional search bar will open for you to select your community. So for counties, we have data tables available for every county in the United States. And for cities, we have a data table available for cities with a population greater than 75,000. And so it's not a perfect solution, but if you represent a smaller city, we recommend looking for the corresponding county to use as a proxy when looking at your data table. And so once you select your county or city, an additional button will show up that says View Data Tables. And when you click that, the data tables will appear in a new tab in your browser. So this is an example of how the data table page will appear. You'll notice to the left that there's a navigation tool titled On This Page with every pillar listed below. But I also wanted to say that the page has a continuous scroll option. So if you just start scrolling down, you'll be able to view all the mobility metrics on the sheet. And another neat feature of the mobility metric sheet is that the link, since you opened up a new tab, is actually a shareable link. So you'll be able to copy and paste that as it is and share it with others, and they'll be able to see the page that you've created. So I know that was a really brief tutorial of how to access the data tables. Like Gabby mentioned, there will be time at the end if anyone wanted to review any of what I just overviewed, but I'm just going to move forward now into sharing some examples of how communities have used the Upward Mobility Framework, and also going to be pointing to some resources that you can use if you're looking for a way to apply the framework in your work, or if you're looking for a place to start. So earlier today, we talked about the Upward Mobility Cohort that we partnered with from 2020 to 2022. And in that partnership, we were testing the utility of the framework and the mobility metrics. And at the end of the 18 months of technical assistance, each county team published a mobility action plan, which outlined a set of strategic actions that they were planning to take to boost mobility from poverty in their community. And so all of these plans are publicly available for folks if you'd like to check them out. And I know Katie just dropped a link for them in the chat, and I'll be walking through some of these in more detail in just a minute. Before walking through those examples, I wanted to point you to one additional resource, which Will was talking about earlier today. This is the Planning Guide for Local Action. And so the Planning Guide builds off of the work that we did with the Upward Mobility Cohort. So in 2022, the Urban Institute team released this planning guide to assist other municipalities and their partners in boosting mobility from poverty in their community. And so the guide offers a beginning point for people wondering where to start, and it outlines a roadmap of steps for doing this work. It is really comprehensive and walks you through each step of the planning process, including building a cross-sector team, gathering and analyzing data, conducting community and stakeholder engagement, and identifying needed systems change to boost mobility from poverty and advancing equity in communities, all of which was built off of the lessons learned from the counties in the Upward Mobility Cohort. And so with that, I'm just going to walk through a couple of examples from the Upward Mobility Cohort. As Gabby mentioned earlier today, community engaged methods have been core to our approach as they bring residents into every stage of the planning process to help set priorities rather than to just give feedback at the end. And so many of our counties in the cohort chose to hold data walks, which use data sharing as the foundation for collaboration. And so for those who might not be familiar, in a data walk, residents move through a presentation of posters with information about their communities, including data tables, charts, infographics, and are given a space to react and discuss what they're seeing with facilitators. And these sorts of open conversations about the data can empower residents to explore the conditions of their community and identify any gaps in services or programs that could be strengthened. And I think also, like Gabby mentioned earlier, most importantly, this is an opportunity for community members or residents to push back on the data if it doesn't reflect their lived experience. And so in Boone County, Missouri, using the results-based accountability framework to help set goals for their work, they held a data walk that presented both the mobility metrics and local data to residents. And so with that, they then selected 3 priority areas to focus on, including early grade literacy, fair and inclusive housing, and jobs and workforce development. And so to advance work in these areas, Boone then set up 3 work groups led by community member facilitators. And these work groups identified key strategic actions in the 3 areas that I just mentioned. And so these actions were improving wraparound services for young children, increasing second chance leasing opportunities, and implementing upwardly mobile business practices. And then an additional example was in Summit County, Ohio, where the Mobility Coalition used an existing annual pulse survey to ask about community priorities. They then did a second survey with people experiencing hardships to get their perspectives on the proposed areas of focus. And so this then resulted in an action plan centered on mental health and juvenile justice with a goal for a more holistic approach to improve outcomes for adolescents. And so, of course, you can read more about both of these examples in the mobility action plans that we dropped a link for earlier. And before we open it up for questions, I just wanted to quickly recap the resources that we discussed because I know it was a lot of content today. And these will all be included in your follow-up and in this slide deck. And so the resources were the Upward Mobility Framework, the Exemplars research report that Will talked about, and then the mobility action plans, the planning guide for local action, and the data tables. You'll find a lot of other resources on the Upward Mobility website, the project website, including our blog that Gabby referenced earlier, And there's a blog mentioned on the page here about how policymakers can use measures of mobility from poverty affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's also an evidence resource library, which has most of the literature that we use to come to the selection of the predictors that we did, because I know folks are often wondering, how did we choose those predictors specifically? And so there is a library of resources as well, including a lot of other research reports. And then finally, I know we've been plugging this throughout the presentation today, but we're hoping that everyone will join us for the next session on the 25th about the mobility metrics workshop. And again, this will be walking in more detail the data tables and making sense of the information available on the data tables, in addition to discussing how to analyze and leverage the metrics to achieve your upward mobility and racial equity goals. And so with that, I can invite Gabby and Will back up here and pass it over to Will for any questions folks have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arzo, and thank you everybody for engaging throughout the presentation. Really appreciate it. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but wondering if anyone would like to come off mute with a question. You can raise hands. There should be on your screen either a raise hand function, or towards the bottom there's 3 dots, and then you would click on that, and then there's a raise hand function there. Glennon, feel free to ask your question. Thank you.
Hi. I haven't had time to go through all of your data, but I am curious. It looked like a lot of it was ACS data, which we can probably get at the track level. I'm very interested in neighborhoods and comparing neighborhoods, not cities, especially because I live in a big city and there's a lot of diversity between neighborhoods would be one way of saying it. Is most of your data that I could access at a smaller scale if I wanted to recreate it at a neighborhood level?
That's a great question. Yes, we have a GitHub repository on the website that has all of that data info for people who know how to use it as
I will find
see
it.
fit.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
And I'm yeah, thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Glennon. And I'm just gonna read out this comment from Diana, appreciating the resource, and then just wondering about the best way to give feedback about one of the indicators around concern that the housing affordability metric does not account for higher income households taking up much of the housing that would be otherwise available to a low income renter. So my suggestion would be our data team would be very interested in engaging on this comment or question. And one of the links we provided had an email that you could write to that we can make sure to share in the chat, that you could engage with us directly and talk with some folks about the data team. You can also see, there it is, upwardmobility@urban.org. Thank you, Katie. You can also see our methodology on the website to try to understand why some of the indicators were developed in the way that they were, if that could potentially help you understand what you see as a potential challenge with that. But I'd encourage you to engage with our team. I imagine folks would be really interested in talking through their process and developing that indicator. And with that, I see Jennifer has raised her hand.
Yeah, my question is kind of a follow-up to the, excuse me, the housing affordability, because it shows my county as everything is over 100, and we've got other reports to indicate that it is not, and that extremely low income is very limited in finding affordable housing. And so I don't know if some of it is not been taken into account because of what the reality is post-pandemic in 2024, and some of the data is right, getting enough information and getting it timely, because we're currently experiencing the opposite. And the same thing, I know, like with the housing stability, our youth numbers have gone up as well. So I just didn't know if you could kind of talk about that. Oh.
Yeah, no problem. And a little hard to comment specifically without knowing the jurisdiction. And even if I do, I wouldn't be able to respond in real time probably, but a couple potential reasons for this. One is that the data that you're looking at there is probably more outdated than the data that you're familiar with. So I don't know how drastically that's changed in your community. But a lot of the data sources are from a few years ago, and that is questions we've gotten, and we will be updating these data sources in the summer of this year, forthcoming. So the data sources broadly will be updated. So hopefully that's helpful. Another point to potentially look at is we are looking at all these metrics as metrics that we can gather from ACS or other sources that we can utilize at a national level where possible, so that we can gather all this information across 300 counties, et cetera. And I mention that because some jurisdictions have lower quality data scores than others, and a lot of the local data might be a lot better, frankly, than the data that we have available here. This is meant to be a resource across lots of jurisdictions, which comes with some limitations. So again, I don't know the data quality that's showing.
Yeah, it shows strong for my location, but it could also be the county versus the municipality in Indiana, and so it's just quite different. It's the opposite. This is painting the opposite picture of what the reality is. So I was, but so it's good. I'm glad to know that you'll be updating it in the summer. That will be helpful. Thank you.
Excellent. And then depending on the size of your city and your jurisdiction, you can also separately search for the city there. Anyway, it sounds like you're on top of it. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, and I'd encourage you for that specific question too, for your jurisdiction, I'd also encourage you to engage with our upward mobility at urban.org page, and we can help kind of diagnose what some of the data challenges are potentially with that tool for your community. And then just seeing a note from Diana that in Seattle, our research shows that about 1/3 of rental units that have rents affordable at 80% of AMI are actually occupied by renter households with incomes above 80%. Which is really interesting. And that is just one, and Gabby's mentioned this just broadly again, and I just said this, but this tool is intended to be a tool that's helping identify different sources of data for metrics, not just focus on economic success, but other components that are potentially less used, but trying to do so across lots of jurisdictions. So if folks are really looking to dive deeply into some of this information, or to dive even deeper into demographic differences and such, we encourage folks oftentimes to engage with local data sources or with local universities or others to potentially utilize that information that we won't be able to cover with this resource.
One thing I wanted to add, I think it's a really interesting convo with housing specifically, is like, I think we've all mentioned at some point during this, is that like the metrics are a starting point, and like Will said, they're intended to be broad and applicable across a wide range of geographies. And also the metrics can be really useful in, since it's all publicly available data, a lot of it is ACS data, like revealing what the data is that most people have access to. And so like for local decision makers, if the data they have is not giving that nuance, like Diana, you're noting about the fact that these units that have affordable rents are not being occupied by renter households who have by lower income renter households, I think that's important nuance that you can then bring in a case making kind of way of being like, yes, if you look on it just on its face, the data shows this. However, we have additional research that gives context to why this number may be appearing this way, and building it out from there. So the local data and the data that folks do within their communities is much richer than what any kind of national source can have. But this is a good starting point and a good kind of level setting tool for building out those policies.
So we maybe have time for one last question, if folks have them.
I'll jump in with one. This is David Higuera in Tucson, Arizona. Is there an easy way using the tool to compare various counties or various cities? I'm thinking in Arizona to compare various counties to one another in a way that you can see the data side to side.
Gabby, were you going to jump in there? Sorry. That is something we're also working on. One of the forthcoming tools that's going to be coming out a little later than this summer will be data dashboards that hopefully can be utilized to compare jurisdictions. As of now, we've done this quite a bit ourselves, but you can it's not the answer you're looking for, but you can open tabs, if you will, and you could gather that information between metrics between Tucson and Flagstaff and other places in Arizona and Phoenix and such, and then compare them that way. They're not intended to be one-to-one comparisons necessarily either, because there's data quality differences, et cetera. But certainly that is something that all of that data is available in there, and you could just pull them up with fact sheets. We oftentimes, with the work that we're doing, create PDFs of different communities and print them out and go through them and engage in that level. But it's not the dashboard level view that you're talking about potentially, which is something that we are working on.
Thank you.
Great. And just noting that Katie put in the chat that there is a survey that hopefully folks can take. Should be quite brief, only a minute or two to fill out. You can also scan it there on the screen if you would like. And then otherwise, just thank you all for taking the time to engage with us. As I mentioned, there was a link at the beginning too for another training taking place on the 25th of this month. There will be a much deeper dive into the metrics. We really touched the surface on the metrics, and that one will be a greater opportunity to dive a lot deeper into the metrics and also work with a number of folks that help develop the metrics and populate them on our data tables that are live. So if you have the time and are available February 25th, sorry, not February 25th, April 25th, folks should join the training and engage some more in the metrics. And with that, thank you so much and appreciate everyone's time. Have a great day.